And welcome to this edition of Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Hello, Ray. How are you?
I'm good this morning, Keith. How are you?
I'm good. And we have a guest that we've had on the program before. So why don't you introduce him, Ray?
Oh, well, I'm glad to have Clifton Truman Daniel on with us today. He's, of course, a grandson of President Truman, and he's involved a lot with his grandfather's presidential library, and he's also been to Oak Ridge. So we'll talk with him today about what's going on in his life, and maybe we'll talk about Oak Ridge a little bit. Clifton, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Ray. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very good. Well, tell us the latest about the presidential library. I think you've been doing some renovations, some upgrades. Talk about that a little bit.
Yes, I have not been doing those personally, Ray, since that would be bad for the library. But we have just, we not long ago completed a $30 million restoration renovation of the library that includes a new exhibit space, up-to-date exhibit methods. There's more material, more of the archival material and museum library material in the exhibits. We've been able to expand it, rework the route through the library so that it makes more sense. And the front entrance is now, front entrance has been in front, but people park in the back, and that's always been a problem because people have to park in the back and walk all the way around the library to go in the front. Now there's a beautiful new 2-story atrium. You park in the back, you start in the back, so it all makes more sense for visitors, and we've gotten some really good reviews. I think it's wonderful. I mean, that library is I'm actually a month older than that library. So I've been going there. Yeah, that puts things in perspective.
Yes, it does.
And I never get any $30 million facelifts. It's terrible. They've really done a spectacular job. It looks better than it ever has.
And remind us once again where the library is for those who don't know.
It is the Truman Presidential Library and Museum is in Independence, Missouri. It is less than a mile from my grandparents' home. Mm-hmm. And the fun story about that, for years, the early years after it was completed, Grandpa had a working office in the library. He went every day. And early on in that, he decided, well, I'm less than a mile from home. I'll go home for lunch. And he walked up the road and he walked in the front door, and my grandmother, grabbed her chest and said, "Good God, you scared? What are you doing here?" And he said, "I just came home for lunch." And she said, "You haven't been home for lunch in 35 or 40 years. You don't start now." She had plans.
That kind of reminds me, I was talking to my wife the other day about retiring, and she says, "Wait a minute." She says, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know. I guess I'll stay home." Well, I don't think so. So, kind of the same thing.
Exactly the same thing.
Uh-huh.
Oh, well, my wife used to say she couldn't tell any difference when I retired. I was still doing the same things I was doing before I retired. And I told her, I can tell the difference. I used to get paid for doing this.
Woo.
Oh, yeah. That happens when you retire.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. Good to hear those improvements are being made there. What else have you been into recently that you can talk to us about?
Well, lately, since the fall of 2017, off and on, and the pandemic has kind of put a crimp in this, I have been playing my grandfather on stage in the one-man show Give 'Em Hell Harry, which James Whitmore originated back in 1975. It was written by a man named Samuel Gallu, Gallu. And I saw the play years ago as a 19-year-old on an international flight with my mother. The flight attendant came up and said, "Mrs. Daniel or Miss Truman, would you like to watch Give 'em Hail Harry. It's showing back, and you fly with my mother. You sometimes flew first class, which was nice. And we were up in the first class section. The flight attendant came up and said, "Would Give 'em Hail Harry's playing back in steerage. Would you like to go? Would you like to go watch?" And my mother said, "No, I've seen the damn thing." And I said, "Well, I haven't." And she said, "Fine, knock yourself out." So I went back and coached and watched the show. It's a good show. I enjoyed doing it. And we've the last time that Polly and I did it, and I take my wife Polly with me every time, because I'm just the entertainment. She has to do the hair, the costumes, props, the makeup. I don't become Harry Truman without my road manager. And the last time we did the show was at the Truman Little White House in Key West, which was a lot of fun, because COVID rules. We did it outside. We did it on the lawn.
Wow.
And of course, being Key West, there was an open bar, so everybody was in a very good mood. And the Polly reminded me that the Truman Little White House has one of the limousines, one of the fleet. They had a fleet of limos that when Grandpa was there, they had to get him back and forth, and other dignitaries. So they've got one of the original limousines from that era that it's part of the exhibit. They park it outside the little White House, but for both performances, we started down the street and they drove me up to the stage in that limousine and let me out. So we had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun with that. It was, and that limousine, wonderful car, gets 5 miles to the gallon. And takes leaded gasoline.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a rolling artifact. But yeah, the show is great. We have I think we have a couple more dates at the end of this year, but as I said, the pandemic has made it a little hard to do that.
Well, I'll have to say that I thoroughly enjoyed my visit to the little White House in Key West, and I believe that while I was there, I texted with you and told you that which room I was in and that sort of thing. That was a lot of fun.
Good.
And that's a neat little location down there. And I'm glad you were able to do that show and do it outdoors. But the pandemic's still hanging on, but it's getting, travel's getting a little bit easier. I was able to go on a Mississippi River cruise a few weeks ago that had been planned for some time. And interestingly enough, on the cruise, there's one day when there's no excursions. You don't have any cities to go to. You're just motoring up the Mississippi River. So they learned that I was the historian for the city of Oak Ridge, and they gave me an hour at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in the lounge to put on a presentation about the history of Oak Ridge. I'm glad to tell you that the place was full.
Nice.
We had for an hour on the Mississippi River talking about the Manhattan Project and Oak Ridge history.
It's a good story, Ray. Oh, sorry, Keith, cut you.
Oh, you go ahead.
It is a good story. When you mentioned at the top of the show that I've been to Oak Ridge, but I learned a lot in my 6 days in Oak Ridge, things that I never expected, from the semestos, the materials, the building, the different sites, the valleys, the ridges between for safety, right up to I never really thought about how a nuclear reactor works, and came away understanding that pretty well. So there's a lot to learn in Oak Ridge. Good story. No wonder you had a full lounge.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, still, when you talk to people about Oak Ridge, they immediately know what you're talking about, but their connection is merely to the Manhattan Project and to the bomb. Beyond that, they, generally speaking, don't have very much information, ready information about what is going on during the Cold War, what's going on now, and those kinds of things. So it did pick the interest of the people on the cruise. So I carry a little thumb drive with me anytime. And so when they when they say, "Oh, we want you to talk about that," I'll just say, "Well, let me plug it in."
You know, Ray's kind of like the gospel singers that show up at church with their sheet music under their arm, and they say, "We didn't come to sing."
Yeah.
How did that sheet music get there?
That's exactly right. He's always ready. He's always ready to go. I was going to mention last week I was at a conference in Chattanooga, and I stayed at the Reed House, which is a old classic. I mean, it's probably the oldest hotel in Chattanooga. I think they were celebrating its 150th anniversary when I was there, and they've got a wonderful historic display, and they talk about over the years the different things. It's supposedly one room is haunted because of a murder, and they play that up, of course. But I don't remember what it was, but they did have a date where Harry Truman stayed there. You know, and it was this is a gorgeous, beautiful, old historic hotel right downtown Chattanooga. I have no idea how the state of Tennessee can afford to send teachers to stay there and have a conference there, but they did, and but it was beautiful. But I remember, and I don't remember exactly what the date it was, but I remember seeing his name as part of the display, the timeline of the things that have happened there over the years.
There's a nice, comfortable little house in Zebulon, North Carolina, that if you the owners have preserved it. Most of it from the days from the 50s and 60s. If you go upstairs and you look between two bedrooms upstairs, there's a little plaque that says Harry Truman slept here. And that's because that house originally belonged to my Daniel grandparents, my father's parents. And my grandfather Truman stayed at the house. So both sets of grandparents hanging out together in Zebulon, North Carolina, I think before or just after my folks were married. But Holly and I went there 25 or 30 years ago, just on a whim, and managed to find the house. I hadn't been back since I was eight or 9 years old, and lucked out and found it. And the owners invited us in, and they preserved the front half of the house as it was when my grandparents owned it.
Well, would you talk about your mother a little bit?
Sure. In what regard?
She seems to be a character, or seems to be a character, and you have a unique perspective, being, her son. So,
God, where to start? She was Harry and Bess Truman's only child. She was born after my grandmother suffered a couple of miscarriages, so she was very precious to them. The three of them formed a very tight-knit family unit. Always had each other's backs. Mom started taking singing lessons when she was 10, 11, 12 years old, somewhere in there. And it quickly became apparent that she had some talent, so that if you read my grandmother's letters from the period, and there are very few of those that exist, but there are several of them that talk about carting Mom back and forth to singing lessons, and even I think the assertion that she was getting pretty good. So she went on to the singing career when my grandfather was in office. And of course, you all must know, and your viewers must know the story of when she sang in 1950 at I think it was Constitution Hall. Now, Paul Hume, the critic for the Washington Post, gave her a less than glowing review. And Grandpa read that in the morning. And his best friend and press secretary, Charlie Ross, had just died at his desk the day before of a massive heart attack. And the Korean War was in full swing, or beginning to get into full swing. And Grandpa was not in a good mood. And he wrote Mr. Hume a very terse letter that ended with, if I meet you someday, you're going to need a steak for black eyes, a new nose, and perhaps a supporter below. And mailed that off. And of course, the story I heard was that Mr. Hume took it to his editor, his publisher, and said, "Look at this nasty letter we got from Harry Truman. What are we going to do about it?" And the editor opened one of his desk drawers and said, "Put it in here with all the other nasty letters we get from Harry Truman." And I think probably as a joke, but Hume mentioned it to a friend in another paper and it got out. They weren't going to publish it originally, I think, but it got out. And my mother, I told that story to a group of retirees in Evanston, Illinois, years ago when my mother was still living. And a lady put up her hand during the question and answer period, and she said, "You know, I knew Paul Hume." And I said, "Really? And what way?" She said, "Well, I used to accompany him." And I didn't get it at first. I thought, accompany him where? And she said, no. I played keyboards. And I said, "Whoa, he sang?" And she said, "Oh, yeah." And I didn't know that at the time. And I said, "Well, I have to ask on behalf of my mother, how was he?" And she smiled and said, "Like a cow mooing." And I called my mother that night when I got home, and I told her that story, and the line went dead. And I thought, what's going on? Turned out she was laughing so hard she dropped the phone. So she had always, and to be fair to Mr. Hume's memory, he was actually quite an accomplished singer, like my mother was. Don't know why that review came out. Maybe she didn't have a great night or he was in a bad mood. He and Grandpa patched it up, by the way, afterward. Yeah, Mr. Hume visited the library and Grandpa showed him around. They put it all behind him. So, and Mr. Hume was an accomplished singer and musician. That's my mother. She loved that story. But she was, Mom, she wanted her own career. She wanted away from the White House, away from being just the president's daughter. She wanted her own life and her own career. When I was growing up, we knew her as not so much as a singer, but as, she did television, she did radio. And then I believe it was 1980, she started killing people in Washington, D.C., one at a time in the pages of books. I always thought that was, she could do that from the comfort of her living room.
Wow.
Oh, that's good.
But that was Mom.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Keith, you're right. He has unique insight that we couldn't get otherwise.
Of course.
A little hidden history here. Oh, well, Clifton, tell us a little about your association with Japan and what you've done there and what's going on there.
All right. Well, years ago, when our son Wesley was 10, we hadn't been living in Chicago very long. And Wesley came home from school one day with a book, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. And for those of your viewers and listeners who don't know the story, Sadako Sasaki was a real little girl who lived in Hiroshima. She was 2 years old when the bomb hit. She and her family survived pretty much unscathed. They lost their grandmother. They all survived the initial blast, but as they were escaping, their grandmother tried to go back to the house to get something and died in the firestorm that followed on the wake of the explosion. They all escaped, but Sadako was diagnosed with radiation-induced leukemia 9 years later. In an effort to help in her treatment, she followed a Japanese tradition that says if you fold 1,000 origami paper cranes, and that's these little fellas here, if you fold 1,000 origami paper cranes, you are granted a wish or health or long life. The crane is a symbol of life in Japan. Sadako folded, I think, 1,300. Sadly, she died of the leukemia at the age of 12 in 1955. There is a monument to her and to all of the children who were killed or wounded or sickened by the bomb in the Hiroshima Memorial Park today, one of the first monuments erected in the park after the war. That was the first. I learned about the atomic bombings like you did, like all of us did in school from my teachers. The only difference between other students and me was that I could go home and fact check. I could go home and ask questions. But I didn't get much of a different education than anybody else. This was the first story. Sadako's story was the first human story I'd ever seen about the bombings or about the people involved, the people the people affected by the explosion. And Wesley's teacher, Rosemary Barilla, didn't just give them the book. She taught them Japanese culture, Japanese history. She took them to a Japanese restaurant. They had a tea ceremony in class. They folded cranes in class. I came home one afternoon after work and found Wesley in the living room wearing a kimono, or a happy coat, this is a kimono-like garment, standing in the living room with green tea and sushi laid out on the coffee table behind him. We had a Japanese meal that night, sitting on cushions around the coffee table in the living room. So we got all of Japanese history and culture along with that story. Well, I mentioned that to Japanese journalists. On anniversaries of the bombing, Japanese journalists very often look for a Truman descendant to talk about it. And I mentioned it to one of these journalists, and the story was eventually, it got back to Japan, and I had a call from Masahiro Sasaki, Sadako's older brother. And it's a long time ago. I think through an interpreter, he basically said, would I consider working together with him on something in the future, visiting Japan, to all of which I said yes. We finally met in 2010, in May of 2010, in New York at the World Trade Center Memorial, the 9/11 Tribute Center. Masahiro and his son Yuji were donating one of Sadako's original cranes as a gesture of healing in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. And at the end of the meeting, Yuji produced a tiny plastic box, and he took a folded paper crane, tiny folded paper crane out of it, and he dropped it into my palm and said, that's the last one Sadako folded before she died. And at that point, he and his father asked me again if I would consider visiting Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I said, yes. My wife, Polly, and sons, Wesley and Gates, we all went to Japan in 2012. We attended both ceremonies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And between those ceremonies, we sat down with more than 24 survivors, just simply to let them tell us their stories. Not one of them, that the Japanese press, through various reporters and other outlets, began bringing up the apology question. They started asking if I was there to apologize, to which I said, no, that's not the point. The point is to honor the dead and listen to the living and make sure we don't do this again. And that's what survivors will tell you. Almost all of them will say, please don't, listen to us and understand what that was like, understand the horror of it so we don't do it again. That led me to several years working with survivors in New York through an organization, a nonprofit called Hibakusha Stories. Hibakusha is the Japanese word for an atomic bomb survivor. It means bomb-affected person or bomb-affected people. Through Hibakusha Stories, I joined survivors to talk to school children in Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, and the New York area. During the 8 years that program was in existence, they, and I was there for about half that, they reached more than 35,000 students, and telling the story. I would tell them pretty much exactly what I'm telling you now, how I became involved. And then the main story came from a survivor on stage. It was very effective because the students, usually teenagers, they tend not to pay attention. They're looking at their phones. They were riveted, and they all stuck around afterwards. They wanted photos, they wanted hugs, not from me, but from the survivors. So it was a effective program.
Wow.
That's great. That's an amazing connection that you made there with those survivors. And you're right, the education of the children, or their youngsters, teenagers, very important. And they don't, they're not easily fooled. So they have to have something authentic and real. And you provided that for them for sure. That's a good story, and a really good thing you've done there. And of course, not you, all of the others that were survivors is what really makes the story.
Well, you guys, it's same in Oak Ridge. When I visited, and I'd never been before, I came to see you guys right after I was in Japan. I was in Japan. Polly and Wes and Gates and I were there in 2012 in August. I came to Oak Ridge in February of 2013. So it was not long after. Mm-hmm. But I was impressed. Similarly to the museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oak Ridge presents the story factually, fully, truthfully, without the politics behind it, without, you and the Japanese let people make up their own minds, learn the facts,
And
learn what happened.
and I think that's an important aspect of what we're all trying to do. And you're right. In Oak Ridge, over time, there have been several changes in the how do I want to say it, in the way that the people see themselves in Oak Ridge. I had the opportunity to have a young lady, Emily Mitchell, who when she graduated from high school in Oak Ridge and went to college, she and I talked about the Oak Ridge's International Friendship Bell. She had a fascination with that bell. And she went to Japan, to Hiroshima, and as a part of her thesis for a degree in college, she wrote a book. And the way she did that was each week she would send me her thoughts as she was on that trip. And I would publish them in Historically Speaking in the local newspaper. And then when we finished, after all, there was 8 or 9 stories that were there. That made the essence of her book came from those stories. But she wanted to experience what growing up in Oak Ridge really meant by visiting Japan and understanding the full story. And she did that and did it well. And as you know, when the bell was first, it's the 50th anniversary of the creation of Oak Ridge, is when that bell became the symbol, the thing that they wanted for that anniversary. And it was controversial at the time. And that's what I mean by the changing over time. Now that bell is an icon of the city and one that we're very proud of. It's in a location now that's called the Peace Pavilion. It's the original location that it was in when you were there. After 20 years, the wood had become, because of the water getting to it, become rotted and became unsafe. So the bell, over a few years, we changed the location, and it's now in a more prominent location in the middle of Bissell Park, and it has become a community gathering place. Also, changes that have taken place over the years have to do with the museums. The museum is relocated now to another location from where you saw it, the American Museum of Science and Energy. It's in a smaller location, a really well done museum that talks about the Manhattan Project and the major government activities going on in town and the history of it and what's happening today. But when they made that transition, the part of the museum that talked about the city was not transferred with the American Museum of Science and Energy. There just wasn't room. So the local historical society, the Oak Ridge Heritage and Preservation Association, took many of those exhibits and added others that they had, and have created now the Oak Ridge History Museum, and it's in one of the original recreation halls, the Midtown Community Center. So that's an addition. And then, and I don't know, I think the Y12 History Center was there when you were there. In fact, I'm sure it was.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, we now have the K25 History Center, which it opened in the second or the last week of February in 2020 and closed the third week in March in 2020.
Yeah.
Stayed closed for the COVID epidemic. But it is an excellent museum. One of that has more artifacts than any museum you'll likely see. And they've done an excellent job there. We're not through. We're going to build a viewing platform that will let you see the footprint of the K25 building. That'll probably be available within the year or maybe next year at the latest. But what I'm getting around to is saying it's time for you to come back. I've got a lot more to show you than what you saw when you were here. So and Polly get together and come back to Oak Ridge and we'll have a tour. All right.
That'd be great. Maybe this time I'll actually catch some fish in the Clinch River. I didn't do so well the last time. I kept snagging the line in the trees overhead. I don't know how you guys do that.
I have to admit that I don't catch many fish on that river either, but a lot of people seem to.
Yeah, well,
And,
a premier fly fishing spot in America, one of the top ones. Another surprise about the ridge that you don't see coming.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. And a lot of it has to do with when they put the fish in and when they've got the water coming out of Norris Dam or not.
Yeah, that's exciting when they open the dam a bit. That's very exciting, very exciting downstream.
Absolutely.
Run.
We'll get you hooked up with one of our local fishermen that are, we see their pictures of them and their catch, on Facebook all the time. So we'll get you hooked up with.
Well, a good group took me out. We had a lot of fun. They just, they were trying to teach me. They were very patient. He snagged a tree again. That's great.
Oh, well. Well, we should appreciate having you on today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Right. We really do. And we hopefully will have you on again at some point. In the not too distant future.
Just give me a call. I'm always here in my t-shirt, unshaven, sitting in my shorts.
Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing now. It's the new, it's talk about casual Friday. It's casual every day.
Well, I'm in Tennessee, so at least I put a shirt on for this. So.
You're going to get some phone calls about that one.
Oh, I don't care. All right. Well, Ray, anything else?
Well, let me talk a little bit about what we've got coming up. We're going to take a break over the July the 4th weekend. We're not going to do one at that point. So it'll be a few extra weeks before we get back. But when we do come back in about the middle of July, I've got lined up to talk to General Groves' grandson, Dick Groves.
Wow.
So we'll have him on in the not too distant future. And we'll also have Judith Strauber, who is the director of the Japan Institute in Los Alamos, and we'll have her on as well. And then I've got a couple more that we're talking with on down the road. And by the way, one of the most popular programs we've had lately has been the ones about the German nuclear program. Mm-hmm. And Todd Ryder's got more that we can draw on there, so we'll get him back again. And I can't leave without just saying how thankful, Keith, we are, the two of us, for the recognition from the East Tennessee Historical Society that gave an award for this History and Media Award for our program, Hidden History Stories of the Secret City. We started this thing back at the beginning of the pandemic in February of 2020, not knowing how long we'd go or what it would do. But I think you told me we have 50 programs out there. So this will be
I think maybe this one may be number 50. So,
okay.
Yeah, we're awfully close if we've not reached it yet. So.
Very good. Yeah. Well, it's been a lot of fun, and having people on like Clifton is just the key to being able to do this. And the one thing that I think that's come out of the pandemic that's good is Zoom, or the virtual meetings that you have online, and we're doing it through Zoom.
Yeah.
And it does enable us to talk to folks like Clifton without having to make travel arrangements and those sorts of things. But Clifton, you really do need to come back to Oak Ridge.
I'd love to. And Polly hadn't seen it, so this.
Oh, okay. That's all the reason you need is to bring her there. So you let me know when you're coming, and we'll set up some tours for you, and maybe even take you to some unique dining places. By the way, did you eat at the Jefferson Soda Fountain?
I think
when
so.
you- I
It's been,
think you
God,
might
Ray,
have
it's
to.
been, it's been really 20 years.
I know it has. It's been too long.
Well,
But
10 years.
anyway,
No, sorry, it's been nearly 10 years. God, I'm making us all older than we need to be.
yeah, we don't need any help getting
We don't
old.
need
that's
any
for
help
sure.
getting older. No, thanks.
All right. All right. Well, Clifton, thank you. Ray, good to see you. And thank you. And folks, we appreciate you watching. And we'll be back after July 4th, sometime about mid-July with another Hidden History program.